Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's Leaders Initiative seminar. My name is Stephanie, and I will be monitoring things here on the back end. Just a reminder, towards the end of this event, I will be sending out a Qualtrics evaluation, so please take the time to fill out the evaluation, and I'll also include it in a follow-up email towards the later on today. Our next Leaders Initiative seminar is October 13th. Dr. Emily Briseno will present measurements of cognitive aging and ADRD across varying cultural, linguistic, and social contexts. So please chime in next month as well. And with that, I will turn things over to Courtney for the introduction.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Amanda Marr as our speaker for this month. Dr. Marr is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan. She's interested in understanding what contributes to cognitive health in older age and in detecting Alzheimer's disease and related dementias in their earliest stages. The ultimate goal of her work is to apply this information from the study of cognitively successful adults to those early in the disease course to mitigate cognitive decline. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Marr.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. And Courtney, thanks for the introduction. I know you have to hop off, so it's good to see you. Like Courtney mentioned, my name is Amanda. I'm a neuropsychologist here at University of Michigan and am helping with our super aging research initiative here in collaboration with the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. I'm really excited today to talk to you a bit about who our superagers are and what we've learned so far from them. They really kind of bring to light this idea that cognitive aging and cognitive decline is not inevitable, which, I don't know, kind of nice when we spend a lot of our time thinking about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Here on the screen is actually, these are a picture of some of our superagers from the Chicagoland cohort, and you can see it's a pretty fun group. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started if I can. There we go. Okay. I know many of you, but for those I don't know, I really have nothing very interesting to disclose. And so with that, we'll move on to a brief roadmap of what I hope we can cover today. So like I mentioned, we're of course at a Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and our focus is quite importantly and rightly on Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. But today I'd like to focus our attention on the other end of the cognitive aging spectrum, really on these individuals who are maintaining high levels of memory performance into their 80s, 90s, and beyond. We have an individual who's 111 as part of our cohort, so we're really talking about people who are doing quite well. After I introduce you to our superagers, I want to very briefly touch on the multi-site superaging research initiative that we're fortunate to be a part of here at University of Michigan, and talk a little bit about how we designed it, hopefully to learn about some of the resilience and resistance factors against cognitive decline that can contribute to successful memory aging. And finally, hopefully we can spend the bulk of today talking about what we've learned from superagers thus far. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Some of you, I think I saw, are some participant-facing site activity people. And this is a picture of our Michigan cohort that got together, well, part of our Michigan cohort that got together this past spring at the Detroit Center. So you may recognize some familiar faces, and hopefully that can give you a sense of who the individuals are we're kind of talking about today. It's this type of individual. So let's do a little bit of background, kind of what brought about the superaging study. For most of the 20th century, scientists and clinicians really thought that this loss of cognitive ability was a normal, inevitable part of the aging process. I should clarify, this is by no means a scientific graph. These are my clumsy PowerPoint skills put together, but the idea, I think, comes through, which is that if we have on the x-axis, going from top to bottom, memory or cognition skills more broadly, and age running along the x-axis, after we hit about age 65, the thought was that folks will experience cognitive decline, and that decline would be to the point that it impairs one's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. Later on in the 20th century, the idea emerged that perhaps such a devastating loss of cognitive ability was not inevitable, but instead, when that cognitive skills became so declined and so impaired, this was in fact a disease state called dementia, and it's what is shown here in the red line. In contrast, normal cognitive aging was not this dramatic cognitive decline, but instead a more mild loss, as depicted here by the blue line. And so while folks who are following this more normal trajectory may do things like take more notes when they go to the grocery store to help recall what they need to get, those changes are much more mild in nature. And currently, we of course know that there are multiple trajectories of cognitive aging. And importantly, for the study of superagers, we've learned that while average cognitive performance across the population declines with increasing age, the variability in their cognitive performance within that cohort increases along with age. So again, by no means a scientific graph, just some clumsy PowerPoint skills, but you can think of each dot here as a hypothetical person. At younger ages, when we're over on the left side, you'll see that those blue dots are hanging around that blue cognitively normal line fairly tightly. So we're not seeing as much variability in their cognitive performance. In contrast, as we move across to the right, with increasing age, there's a lot more variability. The blue dots are much further apart. The folks at the bottom likely experiencing some pathologic process that's contributing to their cognitive decline, while others are continuing to do quite well. But what I'd like you to think about is what this means when we think about average performance for someone's age. Average performance, in this case, for an 80-plus-year-old, doesn't necessarily mean intact performance. In fact, if we take a look at what would be considered normal performance for an 80-year-old, that could be distinctly abnormal for someone in middle life. So to reiterate, because it's quite important for when we think about superaging, normal performance at age 80 does not mean that cognition has remained intact over time. It simply means that those declines are considered within the bounds of what's normal for a cohort. But that also includes some people who are experiencing these pathological changes. We've stopped moving. Okay, there we go. So while we have a cognitively normal trajectory in blue, the pathologic trajectory in red, we also are seeing a handful of folks who are up here circled in green. These folks perhaps represent a third broad aging trajectory that encompasses some of those resilience and resistance factors against age-related cognitive decline. And understanding what those factors are is really what prompted the idea of the superaging study in Chicago about 15 or 20 years ago. It really started off as proof of concept project. Could enough individuals be identified in order to study these protective factors? And in order to do that, of course, we need to have a single robust definition of what superaging is, preferably using objective criteria. And there were several factors that we considered. The first was age. As you all know, age is among the strongest risk factor for developing cognitive decline and dementia. And there appears to be a notable increase in cognitive impairment right around age 80. So that is what was decided to be used to quantify age as far as superaging goes. The next is that superagers must have really strong memory performance in the context of an otherwise at least normal cognitive profile. And specifically, we wanted superagers to score in the average range for adults who were 2 to 3 decades younger than them. And so in this way, our superagers are really meeting that high bar of intact, not average, memory performance. Some people say, why memory? Well, memory was specifically selected to be the opposite or to contrast what we would see in a typical dementia of the Alzheimer's type presentation. And so when we think about how good superagers' memory has to be, I'm going to take us back to that normative curve that we show at every CPC conference, where on the y-axis we have a probability density, and along the bottom on the x-axis is that normative z-score, where a z-score of 0 represents a theoretical population average, and a unit of 1 equals 1 standard deviation. So scores that fall in the green are considered normal, and better than normal the further you go to the right for a given cohort, and scores in the yellow to red are really representing progressing impairment in scores. And so if you take that normative curve, and I'm sorry I don't have it quite in the pretty colors, but bear with me. We take that same normative curve in the context of a specific challenging memory test where folks hear a long list of words that are all unrelated. It might be something like ball, tree, shoe, cow, pencil, and so on, and are asked to recall those words after more than a 15-minute delay. Here's what we get. So that red curve shows the distribution of scores for 80-year-olds on this test. And the average performance for the 80-year-old group is where that red dotted line is. And as you can see, the average 80-year-old is recalling approximately 5 words at the delay. In contrast, if you take a look now at that green curve, that seems like it's shifted to the right. That's the distribution curve of scores on the same challenging memory test, but for 50 and 60-year-olds. Again, that green dotted line is showing the population average for 50 to 60-year-old group. You can see they're being asked to recall 9 words on average. And then at the bottom here, you'll see that I've highlighted a small section of those overlapping images in blue. So this is representing the top 6 to 7% of 80-plus-year-olds who are doing at least as well as the average 50 to 60-year-old on this test. This is what we're asking our SuperAgers to do. So we're really capturing kind of that top percentage of them. I could be mean and do a little memory test now and ask if anyone recalls those 5 words, but I see that everybody's screens are turned off. So you might be having lunch. All right, here's just another way you can visualize how good we're asking our SuperAgers to do on this test versus our cognitively average 80-year-olds with our SuperAgers in orange, our cognitively average 80-year-olds in blue. All right, I think we covered this already, but in terms of SuperAgers beyond memory performance, we're simply asking their other cognitive domains are not impaired for their age. So they need to be performing at least average for age, taking into account things like English as a second language and so forth. And finally, SuperAgers, we ask that they are free from potentially confounding neurologic diseases, things like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, that could impact their cognitive functioning progression. And all other health conditions, things like hypertension, diabetes, cancer, so forth, we just ask that those conditions are stable at the start of the study. And that's really it. I know a lot of folks have read the Rowan Kahn articles that talk about successful aging and different definitions of successful aging. A lot of them do focus as well on some physical aspects of health. But here, our goal was to identify different characteristics, be it behavioral, health, biologic, genetic, and so forth, that are specifically associated with successful cognitive aging, irrespective of physical health factors. And so that was specifically not included in the definition of superaging. Any questions so far before we kind of get more into the nitty-gritty? Excellent. Okay. So this brings us to the SuperAging Research Initiative, which is a multi-site study now that sort of taking that proof of concept that they showed in, oh, yes, Jeffrey.
Yeah, actually, I just put it in the chat, but
Oh,
how do you know that the SuperAgers were not in the top 5% when they were 50 and so have declined just as much as everybody else?
yep. We will get there. Thank you. That is a great question and one that we've certainly been asking and doing our best to answer, despite not having access to them 30 years ago. But if you stay tuned for a couple of minutes, we'll absolutely hit on that. Great question. Any other questions? All right. Okay. So SuperAgers, we were talking about this started off as a proof of concept study in Chicago. And then a couple of years ago, I think it was 2021, received funding from across, from the NIH to kind of study SuperAgers across North America. So at this point, there are 5 or 6 sites, a couple in Canada, a couple in Chicago. The main ones are listed here. And the goal was to increase geographic diversity, racial ethnic diversity, socioeconomic and cultural diversity of the study sample. We, of course, are really privileged to be one of those sites. So we can think about the dementia literature and the 2024 Lancet Commission report on modifiable risk factors for dementia. And certainly there are no shortage of potential resilience and resistance factors that we could study. SuperAging Research Initiative is tackling quite a few, everything from personal and family history to psychosocial factors and lifestyle to how the body moves and thinks, and then what's going on at a structural and even microscopic level in the brain and the body. And to do this, we ask our research volunteers to come in for several study visits. It's usually 3 or 4 every 2 years for as long as they're willing and able. They complete a bunch of testing measures that are listed here that are aimed at getting an assessment of each of those aforementioned items. And often we think about these folks as they kind of join us and they stay with us until death and beyond, as some do give that extremely generous gift of brain donation. So we're able to look at their brains under the microscope. The study is ongoing. We have 1 more formal year of funding left, plus hopefully a no-cost extension to get up to the 500 enrolled adult target. As of last month, we have over 370 individuals that are enrolled across the North American sites, including 63 here at University of Michigan, quite a few of those being co-enrolled with the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. It's a fairly remarkable feat by the study teams. It's hard to find 80-plus-year-olds who are interested in participating in research, and perhaps even more challenging to find cognitively intact or better 80-plus-year-olds who are willing to participate. But we're doing it, and a big kudos to the study teams for that. I do want to note that the 370 number, it includes not only SuperAgers, but these cognitively average control participants that are also being recruited. But certainly something important to keep in mind as we start going through study results in a minute, we're not recruiting a general population of 80-plus-year-olds when we are advertising for this study. We are certainly advertising for folks who are doing really well for their age. You think you have great memory? Give us a call. And so, you know, these cognitively average folks are still doing really, really well for their age. And I think it's important to keep in mind as we're going through the upcoming slides. The figure on the right shows approximately what states and territories folks are coming from, with the darker red being more represented state or territory. And then over here, I just put in some demographics for you to get a better sense of who this sample is to date. There's a slightly greater predominance of females in our study sample. We've thought it may be related to females being more likely to volunteer for research, women being more likely to live longer, be safe to undergo an MRI due to cardiovascular device placement and things like that. But we're also potentially starting to see some signal where there might be a sex split, with SuperAgers being more likely to be female, whereas our control participants have a much more even gender split. So stay tuned. We're wondering whether being female, I know it confers a risk for Alzheimer's disease, but it might also confer an advantage for SuperAging. I think I mentioned earlier, our folks range all the way up to age 111. Our 111-year-old just turned 111 this summer. She is pretty fantastic and doing really well. In terms of education, on average, our sample remains highly educated. There's a little bit of a range there because with the change over to UDS4, there's a change in how education is being reported, and we're trying to combine UDS3 and UDS4 cohorts together, but somewhere right around a college degree, if not a little bit more. But importantly, not all of our SuperAgers are very highly educated. You'll see that we do have a range of formal education all the way from 6 to 20, 6 being completing about elementary school. So we're continuing to increase the breadth of background experiences, and that remains an important goal of SuperAging. I do want to highlight very briefly, about 20% of the overall sample comes from a historically underrepresented group. This was an initial aim of the project, was to get closer to 40% of a historically underrepresented group, and with some changes in the federal landscape, this has also changed a little bit, but you will see that some sites are doing a fantastic job here and really hitting that 40% mark, while others, some of whom are newer to community engagement, community engaged research strategies, and don't necessarily have those historic partnerships already built up, are still continuing to grow in this space. We're lucky here to be set up with the Michigan Alzheimer's Center and some community partners like the Healthier Black Elders Center and so forth. And so we're doing pretty well. Okay, but on to the main topic for today. What have SuperAgers taught us? I think perhaps if you take home nothing else from today, you can take home the idea that out of the last 15, 20 years of superaging research, and particularly with the expansion over the last several years, what we've been learning, superagers do represent this rare phenotype, and they appear to have some unique behavioral, biologic, and genetic features that seem to define them. And so I'd like to go through some of the key findings with you to date. One question I get a lot is, are superagers just these really smart, highly educated, Albert Einstein types of individuals who have amazing cognitive performance on every single test they take, not just memory? And the answer to this question appears to be no. There is a lot of variability in their test performance. So some very early work that I'm showing here, we'll get into the newer work in just a minute, but I like how this depicts that really about half of the superaging sample is performing within the average range for their age on these non-memory thinking domains, things like attention, their language skills, their higher order thinking and problem solving skills that we call executive functions. And certainly a good number of our superagers are performing in that above average range for their age. There are also some that are performing in the low average range for their age. So overall, while superagers are required to have superior memory performance, we're not necessarily seeing that across all cognitive domains. This finding held in a larger sample of superagers that we published a bit more recently. On the graph here, this is a spider plot. And so when the lines are closer to that 0 at the center, 0 here is representing average. And the further out you go, so that 0.51, 1.52, that's all standard deviations away from the mean in terms of their performance. Our superagers here are being depicted in blue, whereas our cognitively average participants are being depicted in orange. And the darker line that's probably a little bit challenging to see is the average or the mean. And then how thick that bar is the standard deviation. So when we look at memory performance, which is up there in the top left called episodic memory, clearly our superagers are outperforming their average memory peers. That is the defining criteria for superaging. That is why they were selected for being a superager. You'll also note that their working memory performance and their attention performance, that kind of in the top right there, also a little bit better. So we saw some better immediate span of attention, stronger working memory in our superagers compared to their cognitively average peers, although that degree of difference is certainly not as striking as what we see for memory. And then finally, when we take a look at the cognitive skills on the bottom, language, visual spatial, processing speed, which refers to how quickly someone's able to think, and again, those higher order thinking skills like problem solving and judgment that we call executive functioning, those lines aren't very different between our superagers and our elderly controls. So that's really telling us, again, our superaging group is performing very similarly to the average performance of their cognitively normal peers. And finally, we tried to take a look at some patterns across test scores, and we saw some variability, whereas about a fifth of the group, all of their non-memory domains, they were performing really, really well, greater than 1 standard deviation above the mean. In contrast, about 1/5 of the sample, everything was within 1 standard deviation of the mean besides memory. And then in the remaining 60% of the sample, there was no consistent pattern of what scores were really good and what scores were not. So hopefully we've proved our point, a lot of variability in the cognitive performance of these individuals. Now, getting back to the question from earlier, of course you're thinking, okay, SuperAgers don't have superior cognitive performance across all tasks, but maybe they started out with really exceptional memory performance, and so they're declining across time. They just started out from a much higher level of performance in their younger years when they were 50 and 60. And of course, we don't have data to comment on their middle-aged cognitive performance, but here's what we started to look at, and these findings have continued to hold as we've looked more recently at the literature. But when we first took a look at our sample of folks, we were seeing people every 18 months instead of every 2 years. They completed several different memory tests, a challenging word recall test, and a story recall test. And on these 2 primary memory measures that were given at the time, each line here is representing an individual, and what's highlighted in gray would be cognitively normal or better performance than a 50 to 65-year-old normative score. So again, these are 80-plus-year-olds being plotted against 50 to 65-year-old norms. And as you can see, as a group, our SuperAgers are maintaining fairly high levels across that 18-month interval. They're largely remaining within those average norms. Of course, we're seeing a couple of exceptions with some folks starting to dip. And as we continue to follow these folks longitudinally over time, 4 visits, 8 visits, and so forth, we're seeing a little bit of up and down. Primarily, folks are maintaining this very high level of cognitive performance until their visit right before death. That visit right before death, we're starting to see a bit of a drop. But this performance here seems to be holding for many of our folks until that visit right before death, which is pretty remarkable. Well, we get a nice little reminder to myself there. Sorry about that. So we've successfully identified 80-plus-year-olds with excellent memory, and they seem to be holding very steady with their memory performance over time. But what kind of happens when we take a look at their brain structure? So when we look at the brain scans of our middle-aged adults, again, people in their 50s and 60s considered cognitively normal for age, at a single time point, and we compare them to our elderly controls, people who are age 80 plus with normal cognition, we see what we expect to see on structural MRI. The areas here that are shown in red and yellow are areas where the outer bark of the brain, called the cortex, is thinner in our elderly adults compared to our middle-aged adults. The yellow showing areas of more shrinkage, even compared to the red color. In contrast, we take those same middle-aged controls and we compare them against our super-aging cohort. And this is what we see. The brain is gray. This means we are not seeing significant difference in our cortical thickness between our superagers and our middle-aged controls. And in fact, if you look really closely, and it's in blue, but I've highlighted it in here yellow because it's very hard to see, there's actually a region of the brain called the anterior cingulate, shown here, that is thicker in our superagers than even in the middle-aged controls. And a lot of superaging investigation is actually focused a bit more in this area. We've looked at it under the microscope and are using some behavioral paradigms that really heavily utilize this region to try to flesh out whether there are some mechanisms involving the anterior cingulate that may promote successful cognitive aging. But I'm thinking about the question, Jeffrey, that you asked earlier with memory performance. There are 2 primary explanations for this lack of difference between our middle-aged controls and superagers. Maybe the superagers had much bigger brains in midlife and we just don't know, so they're continuing to shrink. Or are they shrinking at a slower rate or resisting age-related shrinkage? So again, we can't go back in time and look at the first possibility. So thinking again over that same 18-month interval that we took a look at their memory performance, we were also examining the rate of brain shrinkage in elderly controls, who are shown here on the left, compared to our superagers, who are shown here on the right. On the vertical y-axis here, I have mean whole brain cortical volume. And then in blue, you'll see their baseline visit. This is whole brain volume. We didn't see any significant differences in shrinkage by hemisphere, so we collapsed it all together. And then we saw baseline in blue, follow-up is in green on the right. And while both groups are indeed showing some shrinkage over time, the superagers are shrinking at about half the rate of our elderly controls. And this is despite having very similar backgrounds, so similar levels of education, similar levels of premorbid intellectual function. We took into account gender and baseline age as well. This difference in this degree seems kind of small when you first think about it. Oh, about 1%, but it's similar in magnitude to the difference that we see in some literature that's documenting differences in shrinkage between demented and non-demented adults age 50 and older. So there may be something functionally relevant to this difference. Some superagers donate their brains at the time of death. And so we've been able to take a look at what's going on in their brains at the structural level. Do superagers have brains free of pathology that we typically think of as being deposited with aging in conditions like Alzheimer's disease? And the first graph here is taking a look at neurofibrillary tangles, and in particular in the entorhinal cortex. Entorhinal cortex, of course, is one of the first sites in which these tangles might form in the normal aging process. And we've got our controls here. These are cognitively average 80-year-olds in red, and superagers are in that tealish color. What you'll see is that in the entorhinal cortex, superagers, on average, have many fewer neurofibrillary tangles compared to their same-age cognitively normal peers. And similarly, I wasn't able to show it here, but similarly, when we take a look at the lowest Braak stages, so 0 to 1, we're only seeing those stages represented in superagers, not in controls. Oh, importantly, I should say that there is an overlap in terms of the density of neurofibrillary tangle density between our superagers and the controls. So, and you can see that pretty clearly here. And that kind of starts to raise some of those resilience factors. What is it about superagers, perhaps, that they're able to continue to show this really good memory performance despite having similar number of tangles? We also took a look at a second primary biomarker of Alzheimer's disease, amyloid plaques, again, also in the entorhinal cortex. And as you can see, there's really no significant difference here between our controls and superaging participants. I'd like you to think back for a minute to the structural MRI that we took at just a moment ago, and you remember that the anterior cingulate cortex was the area that was a bit thicker in superagers, even compared to the middle-aged controls. When we took a look at this area under the microscope, it was pretty cool. There was actually a greater density of a very special type of neuron called a von Economo neuron. There are these large neurons that, to my understanding, this is not my area of expertise, are found primarily in the anterior cingulate and the insula regions of some higher order species like whales, humans, apes. And the graph over here on the right shows our superagers in yellow, shows the von Economo neuron density in the cingulate of superagers compared to our elderly controls, so those 80-plus-year-olds with normal cognition. And superagers, as you can see, have about 4 times more von Economo neurons. My understanding is not a ton is known about the role of von Economo neurons, but they're hypothesized to play a role in social cognition and behaviors like social bonding and intuition, emotion regulation. And this becomes a little bit interesting when we start to get into some of the personality and psychological characteristics of our superagers in just a little bit. All right, so there are differences in cognition. We're seeing differences in brain structure all the way down to the microscopic level. So we, of course, ask the question, does superagers just represent individuals who are at unusually low risk for developing Alzheimer's disease? We started with a very quick look at family history. And in terms of family history, it's extremely variable. Some of our superagers have very long family histories of Alzheimer's disease, and that's what brought them in to the research study. And when we compare kind of what their family history looks like compared to the general population, it's really not terribly different. Genetics work is ongoing. We are collaborating with TGen down in Arizona, and they're doing some really cool work with a lot of different markers. But some early data that they put out from our larger superaging sample is suggesting that some genetic risk factors, like that ApoE gene, roughly the same in superagers versus the general population. So the graph that that they published that I was able to pull, I apologize, these are raw numbers, not percentages. The superagers are shown here in yellow. Cognitively average controls recruited as part of the superaging study are shown in purple. And then we've got just their general population that TGen uses. In blue, our cognitively impaired general population. And as you can see, those are skewing towards that E4 risk allele, whereas their cognitively average general population is in green. What I take away from this is that we're not seeing an overrepresentation of the E2 protective allele in superaging. And in fact, if you look very closely, you will see that there is one superager who's falling into an E4 phenotype. And that's something that will, of course, be really interesting to look at as a case study to better understand some of their resilience factors. Again, not my area of expertise, but there has been an initial genetic whole exome sequencing analysis that's been conducted. This was right before the Superaging Research Initiative started, so this was just done on the Chicagoland cohort. We're currently trying to replicate and expand on our larger cohort. When they took a look at the superaging phenotype and what might stand out, it was really this MAP2K3 gene. And my understanding is that microglia have a high MAP2K3 expression in the brain, and that there is this interest in the role of microglia in Alzheimer's disease, with significantly greater upregulation of this gene in the middle temporal gyrus in Alzheimer's disease versus controls. And then the idea that activated microglia potentially contribute to neuroinflammation. When we take a look at microglia in superagers, we do see a significantly lower density of activated microglia in the cortical white matter of our superagers compared to controls. So this is an area of ongoing investigation. I just wanted to mention it because I know someone's going to have a question about it. All right. Another question we get is, might there be something about the personality of superagers that really is contributing to remarkable memory performance? We have our superagers complete a lot of self-report questionnaires that are looking at things like personality characteristics, like psychological well-being, and largely our superaging cohort actually doesn't appear to differ from their cognitively average similar aged peers on the traits we've studied, with 2 exceptions. First, our superagers are tending to show slightly more extroversion compared to their cognitively average peers, although I should note that both groups are scoring fairly high on this measure compared to the general older adult population. This makes sense. These individuals are participating in a research project. They're not really representative of the population at large. Second, and particularly interesting to me, given what we talked about earlier in terms of superagers having a higher density of those specialized von Economo neurons in the anterior cingulate cortex, superagers report having a higher level of warm, trusting, satisfying relationships with other people. And I want to be clear, it's not the number of relationships or connections that they're reporting that's different, it's the perceived quality of those relationships. Fitting with this idea, an RA here at U of M took a look at the potential impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on superagers within the research initiative, and found that while both the superagers and their cognitively normal peers reported that the pandemic was fairly disruptive to their daily lives, superagers were reporting less feelings of social isolation during that time. And at this point, we don't yet know if there's something different about the relationships that superagers have, or whether it's simply their perceived impact that they're having. But there's certainly a piece, the quality piece of these relationships, that is something we'd like to study. And then a postdoc, she may be here today. Claire Alexander is working with us and is in the midst of taking a deeper dive into psychological characteristics of superagers within the larger cohort. And her early work is really showing that in general, both our superagers and our cognitively normal controls are reporting high levels of overall life satisfaction, lower than average feelings of stress, sadness, and anger compared to the general population, but we're not really seeing differences between those two groups at this time. Again, potentially makes sense. They're coming in, they're volunteering for research, and they're both doing quite well. Where we may be seeing a little bit of signal is when we look at a metric of perceived discrimination. But I'd like you all to stay tuned, and hopefully we'll have some time to better capture that and finish up that line of investigation before we report it fully. That said, there's certainly resilience and perseverance that is coming through from all of our participants. Resilience is really tricky to measure, at least for us at the center, just given the broad array of life experiences that people have. At least one person has been a survivor of the Holocaust. We have a Tuskegee Airman who is enrolled in the study. We have several people who have immigrated to the US as children due to unimaginable circumstances. A fair number of single mothers, which was not as common back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s as it is today. So this is going to be another interesting area for us to explore further in the coming years. Finally, a question I get asked a lot is whether there are things that people can do right now, lifestyle things, to become a superager. And one thing that comes up in a lot of community presentations is, if I eat a ton of blueberries and do 5 crossword puzzles a day, am I good? And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a magic lifestyle pill to becoming a superager. When we started to look at a handful of metrics that we can talk about today. Some of them, and the first I'm going to report on now, are self-report, but we do have really cool work with wearable technology that I'm going to report on in just a minute that is going to kind of flesh out this self-report a little bit better. For all of the figures that I'm going to show you here, our superager percentages are in green, and our average agers are in blue. So first, social engagement. Superagers are nearly impossible to get in for study visits. They are fully packed. Their calendars are busier than I could ever be without just needing to take a nap every day. Some of them are still working, not many, but some are still working, and in about equal numbers of superagers and cognitively average controls. That was the easiest metric I could think of here to present in terms of their social engagement. Diet is everyone's favorite topic, and so far our anecdotal evidence and our self-reported very kind of basic things are not supporting major differences here. We have some superagers that if you ask them what the secret to being a superager is, they'll insist it's because they eat whatever they want and have a martini every day at 5 o'clock, and others will insist it's because they're vegan and they've never touched alcohol. As you can see, a fair number of our superagers currently consume alcohol, although not to excess. In terms of other health behaviors, things like smoking, drug use, medication use, we're not really seeing any differences between the superagers and controls in our initial analysis of what they have reported to us. We haven't done a deep dive into their medical record, at least, to see whether they're telling us the truth about their tobacco and medication use. And both groups are taking quite a few medications, which not surprising given the age of this sample. So we're hopeful they're telling us accurately. And the final two things, exercise and sleep. We'll touch on their self-report, but then we'll spend a few minutes just going through what these really cool state-of-the-art wearable devices are starting to show us. So early evidence is suggesting that superagers are achieving and exceeding that recommended physical activity standards. I think it's 30 minutes a day. 85% of them are reporting current exercise, but so are elderly controls. And again, I spend a lot of time talking with folks. Becoming a superager isn't necessarily the same as purely minimizing your risk for Alzheimer's disease. Certainly, if we take a look at that 2024 Lancet Commission, exercise, obesity, physical inactivity, all those things do contribute to dementia risk. But here, we're thinking about differentiating people who are doing well, our cognitively normal adults, from our superagers, people who are maintaining these really high levels of memory. And so it doesn't appear that exercise is what it is, that diet is what it is. I do want to note, because I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about inclusion criteria, we didn't put any metrics in terms of physical inclusion criteria requirements on our superager. So when I say that our folks are exercising, it's not that they're all out marathon running or rowing crew or anything like that. Plenty of folks come in with canes, wheelchairs, and so forth to our center. What this is telling us is they're moving their body in whatever way is safe for them to do. Finally, sleep. This is a very active area of investigation using those wearable devices, but early evidence is suggesting when they report to us about their sleep, they're all reporting about 7 hours of sleep a night, no real differences. I'll show you in a minute what our sensors are actually capturing though, which again, kind of cool. I'm really excited about this, the current high-tech wearable biosensors. So as a sub-study to the Super Aging Research Initiative, folks can wear these devices for about a 2-week period. We call it SuperAgers out in the wild. They're getting mailed these devices in the mail. They are placing these devices on themselves, often with support of some researchers via Zoom or telephone. But 97% of people are doing it without even a study partner to manage the technology aspect of the biosensors, the Zoom meetings, anything like that. As you can see here on the right, folks are wearing one sensor that's on their chest, one that's on their wrist, and one that's on their ankle. They are wearing this on for about 2 days, off for a day, on for 2 days, off for a day for about 2 weeks. And it's in order to get a sense of things like sleep, physical activity, social engagement, and their autonomic responsivity to their environment. We've shown so far that we're able to collect really good data. I want to say at least 95% of the data is been usable, it's been recovered. There's really high adherence to the protocol, which in and of itself is really cool when we're thinking about 80-plus-year-olds in a research setting. This is a little bit of a busy graph, but again, it's what I could take from the presentations. These are hot off the press from AAIC and being written up for publication right now in a slightly bigger sample. But this was on the first 80 participants that were analyzed, and I'm going to orient you to the chart here. So we have superagers are kind of right here in the middle row, if you will. There were 36 of them. Right underneath are the cognitively average, similar age peers, and that's going to be their metrics. And then going along the top, you'll see that we have some metrics related to gait, activity level, and sleep. The gait metric is really the number of steps they were taking per day. And as you can see, pretty high for both groups, over 8,000, nearing 9,000 for superagers and nearing 8,000 for our controls. In terms of activity level, there were 2 metrics that we took a look at in these initial analyses. The first was the amount of sedentary time in minutes per day, very similar between the groups. And then the next was what we considered to be moderately vigorous physical activity. Superagers, on average, are achieving just over that 30 minutes of recommended moderately vigorous physical activity per day. The controls are falling a bit below that recommendation, about 18.5 minutes per day. We're starting to see potentially a little bit of signal difference there, but there's a great bit of variability. And so we'll need to take a deeper dive, kind of looking more into within group, kind of how this is differing. And then when we take a look at sleep, we also started off with 2 more simple metrics, duration and sleep efficiency, which is the amount of time that somebody spends asleep in bed out of the amount of time they're spending in bed. The goal for sleep efficiency, per some standard, is to be 80% sleep efficient. And both our superagers and controls, right there. about 81 and about 86.5% efficient. Although we are seeing a bit of a group difference emerging here with the SuperAgers being slightly more sleep efficient than the controls. I do want to point out that the duration, our SuperAgers were telling us they were sleeping for about 7 hours a night, as did our controls. Our objective data is showing that they were pretty on it, 6.9 hours on average for both of them. Oops, and I think I forgot to show you my nice little, well, there you go. Okay. Key take home from this, though, is that there's a lot of variability, both within participants across days, as well as between participants. So we've just started to take a look at this data. It's really intense data. And so as I told Boiko at the beginning of the call, stay tuned. This is kind of the start, but certainly not the end of where we're at in terms of our sleep. Just because I have to put in a shameless plug, our super aging work is ongoing. We are enrolling folks across the US and Canada. So if you happen to know anyone, whether it is a family member, a friend, a neighbor, so on, feel free to send them our way. We are on our way to 500, but we have got about 120 people to go. And so we're always looking for more folks who are interested in helping us learn the secrets of successful aging. And I think we can end here with a huge thank you to the Super Aging Research Initiative team, particularly those folks here at U of M. I put the HARC website for University of Chicago if you'd like to learn more. The QR code should also take you there. And please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or to our Super Aging UM email. We always love to hear from folks. I think we did it in time to take some questions.
Yep, we definitely have time for some questions.
Fantastic.
All right, looks like there's one in the chat right now. Let's see.
Sorry, I have no idea where the chat actually is on my screen.
Right at the bottom.
Oh, okay. Chat.
Oh. Okay, it says since the entorhinal cortex plays a crucial role in navigation and spatial orientation, do you know if super agers participate in more sports/exercise in their youth and throughout their life, not just during the study?
Yeah, great question. We have not asked that question yet. It's a really interesting one to think about. And it's very possible. I do wonder whether we might get a little bit, maybe not. We are talking about people who are 80 to kind of 110 years old. And when we think back to that time, I don't know if we would have quite as many women who are participating in sports the same way that they have the last 30, 40, 50 years. But it's certainly something that we should think about. You're right, the spatial navigation piece is important. We often get asked a lot too why we chose a kind of, this is making me think of a slightly related question, why we've chosen a verbal set of memory measures as opposed to visual spatial measures that kind of may capture some of the same things. To date, we were using the most challenging memory tests that we had available that would also be free of any kind of physical limitations if people did have a tremor or something like that. But certainly visual memory is something we're also starting to look more thoroughly at with those caveats in place. Yes, Dave Morgan.
Yeah, so I'm not a neuropsychologist, but I would say that what you're looking at is not memory, but learning. And that, you've really got a learning difference between these two groups. And one of the things we know about learning is it's the hippocampus that seems to be quite critical in this. And you didn't mention that. I was surprised. And a second question I had, if you were to go back and develop a real memory test, which would be items from, let's say, the 1960s, would you see a difference between your superagers and the others? And is it therefore really an isolated learning and not a recall or recollection sort of benefit that these people have?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish we could very much develop a test like you're mentioning, get something from the 60s and really test out that remote memory. I'm not sure we could do that at the moment, or if you have ways to do it, I would love to speak with you and kind of learn a little bit more about how we could develop a test like that. Because I think you're right. I think it would tell us some really interesting information.
I think Larry Squire has such a test at UCSD.
Okay.
Yeah, he was doing it to look at people who had hippocampal damage from hypoxia.
Yeah.
And it was a combination of things like television shows and current events and, things that a wide variety of things that most people would have at least some exposure to.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a great idea. We need to think about how to get it for an international population. I know we've talked about Canada. We also have some relationships with some folks in Spain and are starting to develop a cohort in South America. But we might be able to do some kind of make some country by country versions. That would be pretty interesting.
any hippocampal volume difference?
When we take a look at the hippocampus in particular, I want to say yes. I'm sorry, I didn't put that in here. Tiny bit. I wouldn't say it is as striking as the overall whole brain. Perhaps because our sample to date's been small that we've taken a look at, and we're currently working up the 300 plus participants for the super aging study. They're all going through a free surfer pipeline. I think we started a couple months ago, so we should have that data coming out soon where we'll be able to comment on this larger, slightly more representative sample. Your question about learning is also an interesting one. So when we take a look at things like our Rayvault learning curve, where we're seeing our biggest difference is actually on the first trial of the Rayvault learning curve. So for folks who aren't familiar with the Rayvault, it is a 15-item word list that gets presented to folks 5 times. We ask them then to learn a distraction list, and then we go back to that first list. We get a short delayed recall, and then we get a much longer delayed recall. It's a really challenging task. It's the one that we ask our SuperAgers to remember at least 9 of our 15 words. Some of them are remembering all the 14 or 15 words. When we take a look at that trial 1, kind of what they remember just hearing that list once, our SuperAgers are doing a little bit better than our controls. In terms of learning over the trials, we're not seeing that same learning benefit. It really seems to be what they're capturing at trial 1. But again, we want to be looking at that a little bit more in terms of some of our other tests too, not just the Ray. So stay tuned, and hopefully we can get back to you with a little more information soon.
Hey, thank you for a great presentation, and especially the information about drinking.
Anytime.
All right, we have a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
This one is, this is a great correlative study. I guess, however, people are interested in knowing ways to proactively enhance the chance of getting to the SuperAger status. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so great question, and kind of gets a little bit to what we were touching on at the end, where we know what the factors are that are contributing to cognitively normal aging. And when we take a look at some of those lifestyle factors, that's where we're not necessarily at this point yet. We haven't yet figured out what those lifestyle factors are that may be contributing to cognitively normal versus super aging status. I think the sleep and that physical activity, as we take further look in more and more people, we start to look in with that biosensor data. Perhaps we're able to take a deeper dive into diet, because as you all know, trying to get people to report accurately on their dietary habits is very tricky. We may start to see some signal there. My guess is that we're going to have multiple pathways to getting to the same endpoint, which is this really good, successful memory. So we may have some people who, for example, are exercising a lot, they're sleeping really well, and that's what's contributing to their memory, for example. We may see other people who have some kind of genetic resilience or resistance factors. Somehow, I really want to get and study that person who has that E4 to see what it is that they're doing to really maintain their good cognition despite being at higher risk. So I don't have an answer yet. Certainly that is something that we want to try to look at, but it doesn't seem to be quite as clear at this point.
All right. Do you have time for a couple more questions, Amanda?
Yeah, we can stay on. I think I see one about hearing loss, and
Yeah.
that is a great question. That is something that's being looked at now. We're doing some measures from the NIH toolbox where we're trying to get a little bit more at sensory function. We're having folks answer some self-report questionnaires, and then we're asking their study partners to fill out some questionnaires too. So stay tuned. We just haven't looked at that data yet, but it's being collected actively. And then I think the last question here, do I have information on hypertension or cardiovascular risk factors? Yes. So far, we've taken a look. It was easier for us to start off by looking at medications being reported. And so we took a look at broad classes of medications, things like medications for hypertension, medications, kind of all the different things, the statins and so forth. And when we took a look at that, the medication use is no different in our SuperAgers versus controls. Initially, when this study was started, again, it was proof of concept, and so we weren't being quite as rigorous in terms of how we were reporting out, hypertension versus high blood pressure and so on. So some of that is being John Rader would have the right word, redone so that all of the things are in the same wording in the database. And then with this new study, the SARI study, everything is, of course, following the same nomenclature. So hopefully we'll be able to start looking a little bit more specifically at hypertension, different cardiovascular risk factors, in addition to not only studying their medications. I don't know if that answered your question well, but that's what I got. Excellent. Okay. Other questions?
All right. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you, Amanda, for a wonderful talk. It's always interesting learning more about the SuperAgers, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it in the future. Just a reminder, please take the time to fill out the Qualtrics evaluation. I put it here in the chat, and I'll also send it out later on today. Yeah, join us for our next Leaders Initiative talk on October 13th. So have a great rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.